Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar. I think we're going to give it a couple of minutes so that everybody has a chance to join. But welcome, it's good to have you here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for logging in. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes so everyone has a time to join. All right, welcome everybody. So my name is Katarina. I'm a representative of the Transitions in Global South community of our network. And yeah, we're excited that you're here joining our first webinar today of our new series about COVID-19 and sustainability transitions in the Global South. And I will start sharing, I think, my screen. Looks like more people are arriving, and we can just move ahead with a little housekeeping, with a little introduction of who we are. So yeah, welcome everyone to this first webinar of our new webinar series from the Transitions in the Global South Network. A very hearty welcome to everybody listening from all around the world. We're glad to have you here today. So just a little background on us before we begin. We are an international network of scholars. We have around 262 members right now. We communicate mostly through a Google group, but we also have a Slack space that we use to organize ourselves. And we are a thematic group of the Sustainability Transitions Research Network, STERN. So we work with STERN, we work on socio-technical sustainability transitions in the Global South, primarily in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but also elsewhere in the geographical or contextual Global South. We've been around since 2015, where we formed ourselves at the International Sustainability Transitions Conference in Brighton, UK. And since then, our key activities have been hosting debates at the International Sustainability Transitions Conference, hosting webinars on different themes, and really working to bring a broader voice to everybody working in and on sustainability transitions in Global South countries. So we're all volunteers, we're self-organized, self-funded, we're entirely reliant on our enthusiasm and yes, I want to help, and on input from everyone. So if you want to get involved, please do. We're always excited and about new participants and new people to work with, new organizations to link with. You can reach us at our official email address, transitions.globalsouth@gmail.com, or you can, of course, also follow us on Twitter at TransitionSouth. So today, our first COVID webinar, we're going to be looking at, we realized that there was not that much information coming out of Global South countries and Global South areas, or that it was maybe being a little bit lost in the conversation on impacts of COVID-19 in the global north. And so that was really the impetus that brought together this webinar series. And we're really excited today to have three fantastic speakers. We are going to be starting off with Professor Joyashree Roy, who is Professor of the Sustainable Energy Transition at the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok, Thailand. Next, we will have Professor Mark Swilling, who is Distinguished Professor of Sustainable Development in the School of Public Leadership at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And last but definitely not least, we have Professor Adriana Marotti de Mello, who is a professor at the School of Economic and Business at the Economic and Business School at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and also a visiting scholar at Fudan University in China. So how it's going to work today, we're going to have a brief welcome right now, and then each of the speakers will launch into their presentation. They're going to present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a short space, 5 minutes, for questions that are for clarifying issues about their specific presentations. And once the three professors have spoken, we will go into an open Q&A session for half an hour where we'll be able to have a more detailed debate with everyone. So without further ado, we are very, very happy to have Professor Joyashree Roy with us now. Thank you, Joyashree.
Hi, Katrina. Thank you very much for your nice introduction. And do you mind if I share my screen so that you need to maybe stop sharing your screen? Yeah, thank you. Somehow it's still your screen, I can see.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't see my screen yet, sorry.
Does it work better now?
Let me see. No, still I get your screen. I don't know why. Bipashi, can you share your screen?
Yes, I can share your screen.
Yeah, because I'm getting the screen there, but not my screen.
That's fine.
Hi, everybody, till Bipashi goes to show. Yeah, good, thank you. So what I would be doing is that I would try to discuss with you how I think the sustainability transition perspective from Asia in the post-COVID-19 and also linking it to the COVID-19 experiences. Next slide, please. So what I always feel is that we need to really frame the issue before we go in for. So when we are looking into sustainability, I'm thinking of it within the multidimensionality of sustainability, like social, economic, and environmental issues. And when we talk of a roadmap for sustainability, it is always thought of in terms of backcasting rather than forecast, and which is also now when we are talking of backcasting in the long term, but also given that there are interim goals of sustainable development goals. And then I'm taking that transition is not only a process, but also we are talking about a period of change. And there are multiple transitions which are happening in Asia in different countries. And when we frame the change, there are multiple theories of change, but what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to think that there are basic common elements, which talks about that this process itself is always complex, and it is context dependent. It has the interventions, what are the interventions, how the institutions are, who are the actors, what are the structures within which actors function, and what is the narrative which drives this transition, and also whether it is the sequence or parallel actions which we are talking about. And when I talk of perspective, I think that it is whose perspective, that is very important. And what is the magnitude of the problem, height, width, and depth in relative sense, of course. And when I'm trying to put the perspective on Asia, I do keep in mind that it houses 60% of the world population. So it does matter what happens in this part of the world. And COVID-19, as we say in the scenario building teams, usually that this is an unimaginable surprise. So if we categorize it as that, but then I'll challenge it later. So the next slide, please. So what I want to say is that basically when we are talking about Asia, it's so diverse that it is very difficult to come up with a binary, you know. So, and also Asia, it has various shades of development, starting from low income to high income countries, moderate and fast developing countries, and also ecological hotspots like Himalaya, Hindu Kush region. So the challenges of sustainability are very different across at least these three categories. But if you go down to the context, then it is also going to be very, very difficult to generalize something in terms of transition for Asia as such. And also when I look into the global South and global North, I think that this is such a contested binary that we really need to clarify, to me, from what is my starting point when I think in terms of global South and global North. If we go to the next one, please. So for us, what we do that I take usually global South as a social designation, not the geographic divide. And from that point of view, it is the political, environmental, and economically vulnerable communities. And that includes socioeconomically underprivileged communities also in any national context. Next one, please. Yeah. So when we look into the, let me share with you some of the positive things which we observed during this pandemic. So in the Asian region, right? So although we cannot generalize, but still something we can say. So if we look into that, then we can see that, so pandemic unveiled the value of collective sustainable living. We are all trying to see that how individuals have adjusted, what we have done individually, how we are going to change our behavior, how we are going to live henceforth. But you know, what is really matters is a collective sustainable living, which really came out from this pandemic. And in Asian context, it's a community action that built the resilience and that gave the resilience. And so from that point of view, I mean, Bronwyn and I wrote in 2009 about that sustainable living, bridging the North-South divide in lifestyle and consumption debate, and where we said that what is the value of extended life, family, the tribe, and the community solidarity for harmonious, peaceful, spiritual, and material coexistence. And this time in this pandemic, this became even more clear that why these are really, really important, at least in this part of the world, what we saw. I can go on giving examples after examples how communities supported each other. So it's the people who helped each other, and that's how they really made the whole transition. They're still surviving and making the transition possible. The next slide, please. So what we wrote in that paper was that there are actually various concepts which are culturally and politically and socially ingrained in many of the regions. So we mentioned about India, where it is about ahimsa, which is like nonviolence, and so that how you really live with a community in mutual support. And then in South America, Africa, New Zealand, Japan, what are the things, what are the cultural practices which can enrich understanding of sustainable living? So COVID-19 has really put us into this frame that we have to really think in terms of collective sustainable living, and we can go back and do the soul search and try to see what is there in this collective sustainable living and what is that social capital which we can really build on. So if we go to the next one, please. So I would just give some examples, So if you look into, say, this is a city in Calcutta where what in the suburbs of Calcutta, how they got their vegetables and daily food supplied. It is not online because they are not served by the online big online services. So they really got it from the vendors who emerged as new service provider. They are the e-rickshaws, who are electric rickshaws, usually give mobility service to the suburbs. And now they turned their profession because there was no one on the street due to the lockdown. So they converted their profession to supply of vegetables, food, etc., to your doorstep. So no one could need to go to the anywhere to get the service. And so that's how it was providing the service, new service. So that's the informal sector, which actually saved the the families and the communities by serving. So if we go to the next one, this is also very important that there are non-motorized rickshaws. So they usually carry passengers, but they became the vegetable vendors. But what is the downside of this? The downside was that there were so many because everybody got unemployed. So everybody came to this market because they saw that there is demand. So there was a crowding out effect. So that was a downside of it. But then I would say that this really made it that more cleaner supply of food and services. So next one, please. So if you look into the other side, say what technology did in these countries. So work and education from home, online teaching, examination, meetings, everything became online. Ask me, from Asian Institute of Technology, there was a very well preparedness. And so we did not even miss a single day in the whole academic session for the students. They could complete their examination, they could graduate in time. And so that was one success story. But if you look into the India success story, then it will be very interesting. They tried to do that, but because of the digital divide among the students, they could not really carry it forward for a long time. So what they did an innovation. And what kind of innovation they did? They used the television, which is almost there in every house, for teaching the classes. And starting from even the primary school classes, from first grade to the college level and to the university level. So all classes were delivered through the television. And but we all need to understand that such a lockdown economy, which seems that, oh, everything was perfect in a digitalization and with technology, but then came in Calcutta city on May 20, the Nature's Fury, which is first time such a cyclone devastated the city. And all electric connection, all infrastructure, communication, electric, everything came down. And so everything stopped. The whole life of lockdown stopped. But then still, during that time also, the informal sector provided the at least food supply services and basic necessities, although there was no work from home or formal economy was really not functional at all. Please, next slide. So another thing which I want to bring out now is that everything was not really, positive in this part of the world. We need to understand that 60% population of the world live in this part of the world, but 50% of the world population who live in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia, majority do not have access to safe drinking water, let alone 24/7 water service flow. So if for maintaining hygiene, hot water supply was needed, this was completely out of question for them. So this is an unfinished development agenda, which really showed up more and more its relevance, why this unfinished agenda cannot continue for a long time. I'll just point out that there is something you will see, the change framing dot space. So we started a new space in the online space so that anyone can submit their case studies, and you can go to that, and then you can also see all these stories, even the longer version also. Yes, Pushi, next one. Yeah. So we also want to point out that the COVID-19 brought forward few more things. Yes, so health and hygiene is needed. If we compare the COVID deaths compared to the diarrhea and the other water contamination, which really makes 200 million people to suffer globally, then we know that if the water and hygiene is solved, then it is not only COVID-19, all unfinished agenda also gets resolved. Next one, please. Now I'll just show another side of the story. So for hygiene, you just do not need only water, as I said, you need hot water, so energy is needed, right? So in Hindu Kush Himalaya region report, which we published in 2018, we showed that the problem of energy poverty, which is a problem for food insecurity, marginalized people, and which are also for the gender bias. And so which simply means that there are multiple exclusion which already exist in the society and which are linked to why COVID-19 really created a massive havoc in this region. Next, please. So we have some example that if you just see that these are the numbers which shows that how many people do not have access to clean cooking fuel and electricity in different countries. And so the irony is that this region of Hindu Kush Himalaya region, which is, the river basin of 10 rivers, has hydro potential, a huge hydro potential of 500 gigawatt, but still there is not enough renewable energy generation. So what we found was that, so basically even before COVID-19, it came up very clearly that what is really needed is a regional cooperation. So even if we talk of confining to the borders, confining within the borders, but we need to keep in mind that for energy and water, we cannot have the border closure. And so that's how we really need to think how the regional cooperation need to continue for sustainability of the system. So the next one, please. So can we say that this was unimaginable and imaginable surprise? If you ask me, I would say that it was known. If any disaster comes, then what will happen to this region given this unfinished development agenda? And so what the response strategy did was disrupted the sustainable as well as unsustainable development agenda alike. Next one, please. So we conducted during that HIMAP study that what people think. I did the stakeholder consultation starting from the villagers to the policymaker in the whole region. And we tried to see what are the major challenges which they think. And you can see how disaster and climate change, poor governance and poverty, water security, all these were seen as the major challenges. And so it was known to everybody, right? So it's not a surprise that that these disasters, if they come, but there was no disaster preparedness. So the poor governance really became a major issue. And if you look into the opportunities, it did talk about the regional integration. And there has been lots happening within the region for regional integration in terms of energy and water. But as I said, COVID-19 really disrupted both sustainable and unsustainable activities through the response strategy. Next one, please. So I would say that what we were looking into this whole region was how, if we take a very long-term view of 2080, then how we do the backcasting, and we can think that what is there till 2030, what are the commitments by the governments, and then how they really build on top of that going forward from 2030 to 2050. So we made these roadmaps, and we knew that what needs to be done, but then we realized that there are really challenges now, given that additional challenges have come up. So this whole sustainable roadmap is now is on halt. So how this needs to be taken forward is very important. The next one. So we can see that I'm just giving some example from, say, one of the fastest developing country now in the region is Bangladesh, and which was planning for 8% growth to come out of their poverty. And they have started their social development process, but they are now in a mess because of this pandemic. And then how do they really mainstream their sustainable development progress, and which one to prioritize, whether it is the job, it is the hygiene, or it is the economy growth. So it is a major, major issue. So the challenges for this region is not about how to reduce demand, how to make it more walkable, because here only 10% has four-wheeler and 90% walks or bicycles. So it is not a problem of walking versus private car, or it's but it's more of completely different dimension, and which we need to really realize. And the public transport is becoming a major issue now because of the social distancing, which is again creating a major social divide, which I'm not going to go right now. Okay, can we just go back now? Yeah, so what we want to say that also I want to highlight another issue, which is really creating a social unrest as well as a political unrest, which might show up. And so how do we prioritize that in the whole sustainable transition is going to be very important in this region, is the unfair development and political process, because the cheap workers who are greasing the urbanizing Indian economy, building high rises, run agricultural machinery, grow our food, builds our roads, works in small and medium units, but which are interwoven with the global supply chain horizontally and with the businesses, then in a nutshell, which makes India and Bangladesh to supply globally goods and services at a cheaper cost, they are now have been unveiled, that what really happens to them because they lost their jobs, and it is millions and millions of them. Can we just go to the next one, please?
2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So what I just wanted to show is that, so really lockdown has an impact on the labor market. I'm just giving an example. I gave an example from Bangladesh. I gave an example from India. And just to give from Thailand, where I'm now living, is that Thai tourism, which is a global cheap tourism destination, employs 26%. And you can imagine what has happened to them during this lockdown. Next one, please. Next one.
Sorry.
Next slide, please.
Sorry.
Next slide. Yeah. So what we really need to understand is that in this region, the new normals will be really how socially innovative service delivery models can come up, more local granular technology, but also large regional infrastructure and cooperation in energy and water sector can be taken forward. And a very important learning is that for good multi-level global governance, national, subnational, and local governance innovations are of the first priorities. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Joyashree. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
That was very, very interesting. I'm looking to see if we have any questions right now, short questions from panelists that might want be asking for a clarification of some of the very interesting points that you raised. But I am not seeing any. Raphael, are you seeing any from the YouTube video?
No, Katrina, no questions here on YouTube.
No questions yet. Okay, then maybe Joyashree, if this is okay with you, we leave the questions for the end and we move right on to the next panelist, which is
Sure.
Professor Mark Swilling from South Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyashree.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Ah, yes, here we are. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us
Okay.
today.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is Mark Swilling. I'm a professor at Stellenbosch University, and I'm the co-director of the Center for Complex Systems in Transition. I've been very involved in the South African crisis and connected through various networks to what's going on in other parts of Africa. So I'm going to talk mainly about the transition dynamics within the South African context, but it's important to recognize that the COVID crisis has hit the African region in very different ways. So although Africa is usually just branded as a single place with uniform conditions, that's obviously just not true. So if you, for example, if you compare what has happened in Ethiopia and South Africa, Ethiopia didn't go for a strict lockdown. It went for an emphasis on communication, empowerment, and support through testing and so on. Whereas South Africa has gone through a very, very strict lockdown. That's one of the strictest in the world, with massive implications for the economy. And that in turn has had, as many observers put it, the medicine to solve the problem is having a much more devastating effect in many ways, which is the economic lockdown. So in other respects, you have very different conditions on the African continent. So you have some countries that were growing very fast before the crisis. Ethiopia, another good example of that. South Africa was stagnating. You have countries with a very strong and substantial infrastructure, like South Africa, but in other African countries, you have a weak infrastructure. Some are very highly indebted, with dollar-denominated loans dominating. Whereas, like in South Africa, we don't have a lot of debt, but a lot of debt that we do have is in local currency. So there's very, very different conditions, economically, socially, infrastructurally, and in terms of the responses of different governments. But I think from what matters from a sustainability transition perspective, I think it is fair to say that the primary impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the African continent is to effectively change the narrative that is used to think about economic development and in particular post-crisis recovery. And I want to pick up on a couple of those key trends and points, and then I will relate that more specifically to the South African context. So I think there are 5 key points that are significant. Firstly, there's a renewed emphasis on the role of states. Secondly, there is a much greater realization of the vulnerability of dependence on long-distance value chains. Thirdly, the significance of community solidarity has been recognized. Fourthly, there's the need for rethinking economic policy, but also the economic theories that lie behind those economic policies has triggered a new and really significant and productive debate. And then finally, why it is important to link economic recovery to social justice in new and innovative ways. So, if I can kind of relate these 5 points to the South African context, there is growing an interesting growing consensus in the South African context that the recovery needs to be a green recovery. And what that primarily refers to is the importance of energy. And South Africa is in quite a unique position globally. So South Africa is experiencing the consequences of the global renewable energy revolution. So as we all know, since 2004, there's been a very rapid acceleration of investment in renewables. Investment in renewables is now just on $300 billion, which is double investments in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. For the first time ever, developing countries renewables are growing faster in developing countries than in developed countries, which is essentially why the whole renewables investment program has collided with what we all face in developing countries, which is inequalities, and that explains the rise of the just transition narrative. But this global dynamic is intersecting with a very interesting South African dynamic, which is South Africa is one of the most coal-dependent countries in the world. We have one state-owned enterprise called Eskom, which is responsible for 95% of the country's energy supply, 42% of all its greenhouse gas emissions. And this company, which is a state-owned company, generates electricity from a fleet of coal-fired power stations which are old, and most of them need to be closed down within the next 20 years. All of them, in fact, except for 2. And so what that means is, over the next 20 years, the government has slowly recognized that South Africa has to close down these coal-fired power stations and replace them with an alternative energy source. So there is a very deep commitment within the governing party to coal-based energy generation. But if you want to find funders who are going to invest in renewable, in coal-based energy or new coal-fired power stations in the world today, you're not going to find them. So as we probably all know, over the last 24 months or so, most of the biggest investors, banks, asset managers like BlackRock and so on, have declared their withdrawal from investments in coal extraction and coal-based energy generation. So that has major consequences if you want to build new coal-fired power stations in the South African context. So that has given rise to an increasing realization, even amongst quite reluctant parties, that the future really does depend on investments in renewables. And so there is, and this really does explain why there's this new narrative emerging in the South African context, that renewables, investment in renewables needs to be central to a green recovery, post-COVID economic recovery. So as we all know, a stimulus, the best form of post-crisis or post-recessionary stimulus is a stimulus that meets 2 criteria. One, it has the effect of employing the largest number of unemployed people as quickly as possible. That would be a high short-term multiplier. And it is also a stimulus or a set of investments that creates assets that are required in the future. And that would be a high long-term multiplier. Now, what's interesting in the South African context, but I think it's true for many other contexts, investments in renewable energy hit both those criteria. They can be built quickly and absorb a lot of labor, as we've already seen in South Africa over the last couple of years. But they also put in place the kinds of assets that are necessary in the 21st century if you are committed to the Paris Agreement, which as a country we are, and meeting our NDC targets. So it meets both criteria. So the South African policy context is also moving in the right direction. The president issued a statement that went to the UN Climate Summit last year in September, saying there's a commitment to the just energy transition. The National Planning Commission, the NDC, various policy documents are all aligning around this idea of a just energy transition. The only outlier is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy that is still very supportive of coal and nuclear power. And there's a sudden massive increase in gas. So gas will probably be needed as a backup in a renewable energy-based economy, but not very much. So this raises an interesting question. It's pretty clear that investments in a post-COVID economic recovery focused primarily on renewables is going to be necessary, both for South African domestic conditions, but also what's happening at a global level. But how do you make that a just transition? And what does a just transition actually mean? And what implications does that have for our understanding of sustainability transition? So a just transition is, in essence, decarbonization that takes place in a way that significantly reduces inequality and ultimately leads to the eradication of poverty. So it's combining the traditional progressive developmental objectives with decarbonization. And the question is how that's the big debate in the South African context now, but it's also an increasingly significant debate in many other African countries where renewables uptake is taking place because of the financial advantages. And there's been quite a lot of conflict in other African countries where the social impacts haven't been adequately dealt with. South Africa has quite a sophisticated social impact and developmental impact co-investment strategy with renewables as they get built in many small towns around the country. But in a place like Turkana in Kenya, there's been quite a lot of conflict around a renewable energy plant that was built there without significant connection and integration with local communities. So let me end off by just saying that the large bulk of coal-fired power stations are concentrated in one province, the Mpumalanga province in the northeast of the country. And the challenge is going to be how, over the next 20 years, those coal-fired power stations get systematically shut down in a way that results in the least negative disruption for workers and communities, while at the same time building a renewable energy infrastructure within that province, because there's significant grid capacity, in a way that absorbs those workers who are going to lose their jobs and rebuilds new forms of local economy. And there's a number of NGOs and communities and local authorities who are starting to get organized around that theme. And some very innovative proposals are starting to come forward. A game changer, a significant and optimistic game changer, is that over the last couple of weeks, the Chief Executive Officer of Eskom, the state-owned power utility, has published 4 interviews where he has said things that no CEO has ever said of Eskom has ever said before. He said he's committed to a just energy transition, and and proposed a program for repurposing the power stations as they get shut down. And that has generated an enormous amount of interest at grassroots community level, with various coalitions starting to emerge around the possibility of local authority plus community, civil society plus progressive business coalitions getting around a new set of investments in the repurposing of the power stations that get shut down. And that's where one can start to see the beginnings of this conflation of investments in decarbonization via a very ambitious renewables program, getting linked to the reconstitution of local communities and local workforces in a large number of small towns around South Africa, but also in other parts of Africa that have never before been significant from an energy or even an economic perspective. And that does raise an interesting possibility about how radical can this go. The energy democracy movement, for example, which has got a lot of support in the trade union movement here, but also in many grassroots NGOs and community-based organizations, are calling for socially owned or municipally owned renewable energy infrastructures, rather than the dominant approach at the moment, which is essentially renewable energy infrastructures delivered by multinational corporations with partners from Black business elites. Is there a more democratic, more participatory, more socially just approach to renewables that could significantly result in a reconstitution of power relations? So that really, I think, gives one a sense of the dynamics that are taking place here as South Africa searches for innovative and ambitious ways for thinking about the post-COVID economic recovery within a framework that within a kind of sustainability transitions framework. But I think that the key challenge that South Africa, but many other African countries are going to face as we proceed in this direction is, how do we make sure that this is not an unjust transition? That what we need to strive for and put together and think through in quite clear terms is a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this very, very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I see we have some questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to put on Claudia Santos, who has the most upvoted question right now. Claudia?
Hi, Katharina, thank you. So this question can really be for Mark or anyone else presenting today. So I wanted to know if you have examples from your regions of research of how COVID-19 is being used as a political tool to continue with business as usual, and that way making it more difficult to achieve the transformational justice, whether this is about environmental justice or social justice. So just really looking for examples from your areas of research. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond?
Thank you. Yes, that would be nice, Mark, if you want to respond, or?
I'm not sure if I fully got the question, but it sounds like the question is, are there examples of the way in which COVID-19 is being used to reinforce business as usual? Or
Yes.
was the question business unusual, business as usual? Yeah. Well, the overall narrative, I would say, is that there's no return, even amongst quite established mainstream elites. The overall narrative is there's no return to normal, because normal was unjust and unsustainable. So there's a narrative like that. But that narrative is a bit like a Trojan horse, because inside of it is justification for what is referred to as structural reforms. And structural reforms for a significant, for the Minister of Finance, as well as significant sections of business, is deepening of neoliberal economic policies through privatization of state-owned enterprises, fiscal austerity, and cutting of the public service wage bills, including education and health, at a really weird time. So hidden inside of there's no return to normal, what we need is structural transformations, because of the COVID-19 crisis, is actually a threat, in my view, from my perspective, of a deepening of a commitment to neoliberal economic prescriptions. And it's unclear exactly at this stage what role the IMF is going to play in providing emergency funding. What strings will be attached to that is not exactly there. Obviously, there will be strings, but what kind, nobody really knows. But there is a completely different narrative, and one of the more powerful ones came out today from the former Minister of Finance, B.C. Jonas, who was fired by the previous president, who was very corrupt. And he's laying out a broad vision of a post-COVID economic crisis, where he's using the COVID-19 narrative to say, yes, no return to normal. We have to completely rethink our economic policies and democracy, and justifying a form of state interventionism, which previously wasn't really possible to argue for in such strident terms. So there's two different narratives that are being articulated.
Mm-hmm. And linked to that, we have an anonymous question here as well on, is there any research estimating how big the stimulus package would need to be to effectively facilitate a post-COVID just transition to renewables? And the anonymous attendee also asked, where would the stimulus come from? But I assume it's, yeah.
So yeah,
so a government
there is
stimulus or IMF.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a short-term stimulus of about 500 billion rand, which is about $25 billion. But that's really just an emergency package. It's not part of a post-COVID economic recovery. If you wanted a post-COVID economic recovery strategy focused on renewables, the investment you would, there has been some really good modeling done on that. And basically what the modeling is showing is that over the next decade, if you were really serious about decommissioning the coal-fired power plants and replacing that capacity with renewables, you would require an investment of around 500 billion rand over the next 10 years, or $1 trillion rand over the next 20 years. And that is just in the end of pipe infrastructure. It does not include the upstream industrialization that a massive renewables investment program would catalyze. And that is still not fully calculated. In addition to that, Eskom, the state-owned public utility that I referred to, has got a legacy debt of 480 billion, which the sovereign can no longer help with bailouts. So that would have to be wrapped into the total package. So I would say that over the next 10 years, based on all the different pieces, excluding industrialization, you're looking for you need about $1 trillion rand. So at the moment, the exchange rate is $1 equals 20 rand.
Mm-hmm. give us an idea on what kind of categories we're thinking in here. All right. Thank you so very much, Mark. We will move on to the next. There's a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A that are for you and also for Joyashree already. So we look forward to conversing with you more after Adriana's presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So our third presenter today, Professor Adriana Marotti de Mello, joining us from Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Okay, thank you very much, Catarina, for the introduction. Thank you. First of all, good morning for those who are in the Western part of the world, and good afternoon, good evening. My name is Adriana Marotti. I'm a professor in the Business Administration Department in the School of Business and Economics in the University of Sao Paulo. And I would like to share to you some thoughts and ideas, and about the current situation in Latin America, and especially in Brazil, where I'm based. Okay. So now Latin America is now the hotspot for COVID-19 in the world. And South America, especially Latin America, as you may know, is a diverse continent. And we all have the same problem here. Among all countries, they are from not so diverse heritage. We are most Latin, yes, Hispanic and Portuguese heritage, but we have the same problem, inequality. And of course, the influence of the United States all over the continent. And so the COVID-19 hit our continent with different impacts. And inequality, I think, it's the background for all of and explain most of these different impacts. I'm showing this picture here. It's not a photoshopped picture. It depicts in the left side of the picture here, we have a picture of a poor community in Sao Paulo, the favela Paraisópolis. And this favela is we have just a wall separating this favela from a very rich neighborhood that calls Morumbi. And this picture is not photoshopped. I think it's something unbelievable, but it shows how the level of inequality that we find here in Brazil, in Latin America, and especially in Brazil. So we have some positive examples in countries in Latin America dealing with this crisis. For example, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, they have low rates of infection and death. Of course, I'm talking about the economic consequences a little bit further in my presentation. But what they have in common, these good examples in dealing with the crisis, is lockdown, strict lockdown, and governmental help for both people and businesses. Of course, the economic, after the economic, we are going to discuss how it's going to reset the economy after this. But they are dealing with the crisis with fewer deaths and fewer impacts on life of the people. And from the negative side, we have Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, where in these countries we are seeing now a huge growth in both cases and deaths, especially in Brazil. Brazil is now the hotspot completely in the world. We are now approaching 500,000 cases and approximately 30,000 deaths. And I'm going to talk a little further about the current situation. In Brazil, and how the sustainable transitions could go after in longer term after this COVID crisis. Brazil, as you may know, is a continent in itself inside Latin America. It's the biggest country, have the biggest population. We have now a population of approximately 215 million people. Brazil is one of the largest countries, both in area and economic impact. We are, I think, now last year among the 10th largest economies, but we are living in a huge economic and political crisis, even before COVID-19. Since 2015, at least, we are in a political turmoil. We had an impeachment/coup d'etat that occurred in 2016, and then an election, very contested results. We have now a president and a government that just imitates everything that Trump is doing in the United States. And we are really in a state, we are a kind of a laboratory to show the fragility of states and how this is impacting our short-term response to the COVID-19 crisis and could impact for the transition that we are seeing later. We had just before COVID-19 high rates of unemployment and high rates of informal work as well due to the crisis. Many people just make their way of living just through informal work, like Uber drivers and delivering and selling stuff. So it's really, the informal economy have a huge impact in our economy. And also about the COVID-19, to show how fragile the state is in this moment here in Brazil, the federal government is acting in denial. The president himself, he made a speech on national TV, and he says that COVID is only a flu, and if people would die, he said it's literally, who cares? And so the option mainly was for the protection of the economy. The discourse, the official discourse from federal government is, then we have to protect the economy. We have lockdown would be a medicine even worse than the virus. And we see now a conflict between federal government and state level governments. State level governments, they all over the country, they adopted some lockdown, some different levels all over the country of lockdown, of measures to social distancing and so on. But we see really a conflict. And also inequality affects how the infection and death rates all over the country. We have huge variation among different regions and different cities in Brazil, also among different social classes, and even between Black and white people. Of course, poorer Black communities are more affected. Death rates are really higher. And we see this showing especially in the Amazon region. The city of Manaus and the state of Amazonas, they are in the heart of the Amazon region in Brazil. They are the worst affected city here in state in Brazil. Of course, Sao Paulo has higher absolute numbers, but if we talk about death rate in 100,000 people, Amazonia is definitely the worst case. We see also the inequality in distribution of infrastructure for health. Even in south of Brazil, in the southeast and south region of Brazil, we see levels of hospitals and availability of hospitals and ICU using the same level as European countries. But in Amazonas, for example, the only ICU units are in the city of Manaus. So from some cities in the inner Amazon region, people have to travel 3 days in a boat to get the treatment or to find a plane to go to Manaus. So this explains the high death and the high level of death in these regions. And of course, the social distance measures that cities and state governments are trying to implement are not working without proper economic help. the federal government launched a kind of minimum income for informal workers. It pays 600 reais. It's at about $100 per month per family. So it's really, it's not enough. And of course, they had some problems in distributing this money, some logistical problems, how to make this money get into people in need. So what we see, some people that cannot comply with social distance measures to lock down because they have to do their life, they have to work, otherwise they starve. So that's the picture of how we are living today here in Brazil. We are just in the middle of this sanitary and political and economic crisis. And of course, the number of cases and deaths are somehow underestimated because Brazil is not testing properly. Some states, some cities are, but overall, we don't have a federal unified policy for the whole country. So it's really difficult and it makes even more difficult to forecast how we are going to cope with this situation. That's where I think it shows and reveals the importance of community solutions, of grassroots innovation, of social innovations that are working and are good examples in short-term relief of the crisis. We have some examples here. One is from my university. It was the development of a low-cost ventilator. As you may know, the ventilator is one of the most important health equipment, health life support equipments to cope with the COVID, with the infection. And it's very expensive. And there's a problem with this. Professor Swilling mentioned about this long value chains, global value chains, that this equipment is manufactured mainly in China with Chinese equipments and parts. And the problem is they are supplying for the whole world. So we have really a supply, demand and supply problem for this kind of equipment. And it costs more and it's not available for everyone. You may have seen in the press the news about the United States confiscating some cargo with this equipment. So one of the main demands is to develop quickly the possibility of local production of a ventilator. And this challenge was made by the professors from the engineering school in the University of Sao Paulo, and some other institutes, research institutes are also collaborating in this project, and they have developed in 60 days an open source project of a low-cost ventilator. I have the link here and try to make it work just to take a look. Sorry, I think it's not, you can see now? No, it's not showing now. No. It doesn't work, but I think I'll have available the link here. You can see more details about this. I think it's an example of an innovation that developed in Global South with our own technology and to meet a need in a hurry. And another example, an example of a community solidarity action that was taken in our favelas. Favelas is our poor communities, our poor hoods. This is, they have an Instagram account and some other social media network of local leaders in health agents, and they are organizing solidarity actions in these neighborhoods. The name is Corona na Quebrada. Quebrada is also a nickname for these poor communities, especially here in Sao Paulo. And so they are trying to organize and try to make a network that exchanging experiences, exchanging resources among these local leaders. Is a very interesting example of social organization, of self-organization of a community. Another example In that community that I showed the picture, this Paraisópolis, I think it's one of the largest favelas in the city of Sao Paulo. The local leaders, they have been trained in social distance, how to cope with social distance in this kind of neighborhood, because people tend to live in small spaces, they have small streets really close to each other, and so how to cope with social distancing in this situation. Normally we have families of 5, 6 people living in very small spaces. And they also hired a private emergency service. They have hired an ambulance and paramedics, because our system, the municipal ambulances and the municipal emergency system is difficult to access all the streets in this neighborhood. So they have hired themselves a paramedic service to attend emergencies related to the COVID. And they are also self-cleaning the streets. They have hired with a sponsorship from some companies and with the solidarity of all the people that lives in this neighborhood and some other people, they have hired a service to clean the streets with chlorine. So it's a solution really to try to make this the environment less dangerous for COVID infections. So, and also thinking about now the challenges and opportunity, and we, of course, have some learnings about this pandemic crisis. The one, I think it was also mentioned by Professor Roy and Professor Swilling, is the inequality as a factor generating social tensions and constant crisis. It's, of course, well known here in Brazil, but I think the COVID crisis just exposed brutally the effects of this inequality. So I think one of the interesting learnings is that universal basic income is now a discussion in mainstream economics here in Brazil. We have a very well-known politician here from left party. His name is Eduardo Suplicy. He was a senator, and now he's a local city senator here in the city of Sao Paulo. And he is known as a huge advocate of this universal basic income. He has written a book and he delivered speeches for more than 30 years. And he was considered somehow an outsider and just a kind of a crazy preacher talking about this universal basic income. And now it's in the mainstream economic discussion to how to implement this kind of basic income and to make it feasible to be implemented. And of course, we are now experiencing, our government is ultra-liberal, neoliberal, I think it's not only, but ultra-liberal. And austerity economics, it's being implemented here in Brazil in a brutal way. We are I think the only country in the world that we have what they call a roof for public expenditure. We cannot raise the public expenditure more than the growth of the economics in 1 year. So it's really this rule is really affecting the investment in health and education, but now it's in challenge. Everybody's, of course, this year this roof rule is not going to be accomplished, and now it's putting challenge the effectiveness of this kind of policy in a country like Brazil. And it also unveiled and showed the importance of the public health system. The situation here in Brazil would be really chaotic without our universal health system. We have a very good, it's not really very good all over the country, but it works, what we call the national health system. It's called SUS, o Sistema Único de Saúde. And the importance of making this system stronger. It has unveiled. And also, as we talk about institutional, about the politic, really the how to develop public policies, this crisis showed the need for a greater institutional guarantee. We have to recover the role of the federal government as a guardian of public policies that are beneficial to the entire population, not only to benefit some groups or their own idea. So it showed the importance of democratic values. Our situation is so tense here in politics here now in Brazil that it's openly being discussed about the military to intervene, the military in the government. It's really, and it's difficult to develop a policy to cope with this crisis of COVID, and also to how to recover the economy in this political tension. But we have some good examples, and we are also working both in private sector and also in state level, some initiatives to resume the economy after the crisis and how to make it better in a sustainable way. And one question that we are asking themselves here is how to resume this fragile economy and how to generate more formal jobs. And one solution could be, of course, the social entrepreneurship. I think we have some good examples of social innovation and entrepreneurs that seek for positive impact for the whole society, not only for environmental, but in a just social way. We have this example that you can also see after in this website. The name is Project Vivenda. It's a very interesting business model that they make refurbish and renew poor communities' houses using the poor communities' workers. They do projects for these small houses to be improved, to be more safety, to be integrated with the basic sanitation network, for example. And it's beneficial for the whole community, because not only for the owners of the houses, but for the workers and for the construction material shops that all belong to the same community. It's a very interesting business model. Of course, the circular economy, I have seen some questions about how circular economy, it's an opportunity to resume our economy in Brazil. We have a very good example of a national policy for waste. The national policy for solid waste is a very good policy that we have implemented here in the last decade, and it has enabled many good businesses in this model of circular economy. Of course, in the short term, we have now a problem. We have shut down all the recycling processes, almost shutting down because of sanitary risk of collecting these wastes. And also another opportunity is to make innovation in these small and medium enterprises. The small and medium enterprises are here in Brazil the largest generator of jobs. So to make these small enterprises connected, for example, to have access for investments in innovation in these small businesses is an opportunity to generate better and formal jobs. And of course, the opportunities in agriculture, clean energies, and biotechnology. These are very well-known strengths in Brazil, not only in academia, but also in businesses. Brazil is one of the leaders in agriculture, in agribusiness, and there are huge possibilities of development of supply chains, of better environmental practices in this area. Also about clean energies and biofuels, for example, Brazil is the leader of this technology, and we could be strengthened, and it's an opportunity, as Professor Swilling said, to generate more jobs in this green recovery. I think it could be, and not only in Brazil, but also for Latin America. And of course, we see some threats also in this transition. One of the main threats, I think, in my opinion, is the cheap oil. We have a situation now that in short term now, the oil prices are negative. And Brazil is a large producer of oil. So I think this cheap oil could hinder all this transition to cleaner energy and also for circular economy. Plastics are much more cheaper now than recycling plastics, for example. So it's could be a threat to this transition. And also here in Brazil, especially with this ultra-liberal government, sustainability is viewed as a threat for businesses. We have a Ministry of Environment that is against, for example, environment protection. It's really a crazy situation. He is a denier of the global warming, for example. This is the level of threat that we have in federal government in this moment. And another, I think it was very interesting, the question that someone asked about this crisis could make business as usual. It could be an opportunity to reinforce this business as usual as well. Here in Brazil, we have a very strong auto industry, oil and mining industry. And this, of course, aerial transportation as well. And all these sectors, they are really good in getting investments and benefits from government. They have a very strong influence on government, of course, because they have a huge impact in our national growth product. So they are receiving investments now to resume after the crisis. So I think it's also an opportunity for these mature traditional sectors to reinforce their narratives, because they, of course, they generate jobs now in short term, and they could ask for more investment and for money and from benefits from government. So I think that's all. I think I have already finished my time. Thank you very much for the attention. Thank you very much for the opportunity for talking here.
Wonderful, Adriana. Thank you so very much. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm seeing a couple of questions coming up. I think just two short questions for you. I'm going to ask one of them, the first one, because it's from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, how do you think bottom-up initiatives will reach a central government that is so inflexible? Can this perhaps be achieved through any pressure applied by local municipalities or by individual states?
Yes, fortunately here in Brazil, although we have this federal government really inflexible and somehow against this kind of policy, but this kind of social bottom-up innovations, normally they work in the fringe of the state. We have, as the state, really the federal policies, federal governments, they don't get into the whole of the country. So normally these communities, they live in the fringe of the society, really. They are in kind of informal way. Sometimes they're not even registered in official records for the federal government. So they exist, they coexist. The government doesn't really care about this federal government, and they can find some support in local municipalities sometimes, but they exist on their own.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I hear you. Thank you. And then linked to that, we have a question from Mariana B. Ferreira Aulo. Mariana, I'm going to turn on your microphone so you can ask your question.
Thank you. So I wrote a question about impeachment. Do you think that impeachment is possible right now? So we can see in the news that in Brazil, the opponents of President Bolsonaro are organizing themselves for impeachment. Is it actually possible to happen, given that the previous impeachment was so recent? And you have talked about a possible military coup. So this would be, I understand, coming from the federal state. So what is your take? Would COVID benefit from either possibilities?
Yes, we are, it's really complicated. We are, as I said, since 2015, with a very divided country, with very polarized situation. And of course, the economic crisis is also a huge ferment for this kind of unsatisfaction with the government, and also could ferment and influence an impeachment to come up. The government now, they don't have majority in the Congress. Here in Brazil, it's needed 2/3 of the houses, of both houses, the lower house and the Senate, to get an impeached approved. And the government is, this government, Bolsonaro government, was elected promising to end the corruption and to end what they call the old politics, this kind of negotiating with Congress. But what we see now is the Bolsonaro is somehow in the, what we say, he's somehow in a weak position, and he's negotiating. They are giving positions in government for other parties in order to gather in a kind of a corrupt way to try to buy the Congress to avoid impeachment. So we have all the options in the table right now. We have this the possibility of impeachment. Some opposition parties has asked for impeachment, and it's in the hands of the president, of the speaker of the House. If it gathers more and more opposition, as it's getting from the economic actors, from the society as a whole, I think it's a possibility. And also, we have another possibility as well. Bolsonaro is also being investigated from some crimes that he committed, responsibility crimes, and he's being investigated from the Superior Court as well. And also from his election, there are processes going on, and he could also be not really impeached, but his election could be cancelled by the election court here in Brazil. So we have many possibilities. And he's trying to get support from military. It's not really consensus among military, but he's trying. We are really in the middle of a huge crisis, just like the US. I think we are imitating completely what's happening with Trump. We are imitating right now.
What are your different scenarios for the recovery of the population and COVID-19? What would be the best case scenario?
The best case scenario, I think it's right now, to get rid of this government somehow, I don't know, and make a government really committed with this, how to deal properly in an adult way with this crisis. We are in a really not terrible situation, I think, from the political point of view, to implement policies in federal level. So I think it's really a challenge.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Mariana, for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana, for your answering and for your very interesting presentation. We're going to have a little poll right now. Have a first poll. And I would like to invite all of the panelists, so Mark and Professor Joyashree and Professor Adriana, to join us for the open question and answer session. But first of all, a little poll to see where everyone is joining us from today. All right, and going forward with the questions, I think we're just going to answer them in the ones that have been upvoted in the question voting. So the first question is this is to all three panelists. So a question on not just old practices well, not just new practices, like innovative practices and cultural norms coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, but if some old practices are being revisited that align with cultural norms. And her example is, in Canada, some Indigenous people have opted to use this time to go out on the land to teach old skills to young people. And she's wondering, are there other examples of this that you've seen? We're gonna bundle some questions. So I'm gonna ask Yvonne to ask her a question now, Yvonne Mutua.
Hi, yes, I'm Yvonne. And yeah, this was my question. My question was, how should African countries with large oil deposits navigate in implementing a green stimulus transition, like Nigeria, because it was mentioned that a green stimulus package is the way forward in this after COVID-19, but it's just a little bit difficult for, as we've seen a lot of countries in Africa. Yes, there's the potential, but if now they have large oil deposits and all this, it's being phased out, what should they do? And so then the follow-up question would be, can the energy transition be equal or greater than developed countries? Because it was mentioned that the potential for renewable energy in Africa is much greater, and there are more companies that are willing to invest. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Yvonne. Mark Purdon, we have a question from you. Mark, I'm not hearing Mark. All right, then Joseph. Hold on just one second. Joseph, we would love to hear your question.
Oh, my question is very basic. I think one of the early speakers, two earlier speakers, were focusing primarily on transitions with renewable energies, the major transition. And the third speaker touched upon it, and that was that there is an option that the transition to sustainability can be associated with the circular economy. But we also know that there's possibilities where if you start formalizing the circular economy through neoliberal mechanisms, that the beneficiaries of this situation will probably be the large companies, the more formal economies, going back to almost to normal. How can this be reconciled is the essential question. How can the circular economy still help those who are most socially and politically disadvantaged and vulnerable communities? A lot of them rely on this. So how can the country still support that without shifting the, making it more inequitable than it was before, if they decide? First of all, the first part of the question is, should countries use circular economy as a way to transition? And the second one is, if they do, how do they maintain the equity and the justice as well as the sustainability aspects?
Okay, thanks for your question. And one more question from Satoru.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Satoru from Tokyo Institute of Technology. My question is to Mark. You mentioned just transitions. As to thinking about what is justice during steering transitions, Western researchers are able to refer to from Plato to Peter Singer's as a common academic legacies. However, Asian, Africans, and Latin Americans, including Japanese, don't have comparable knowledge, legacies about what is justice. So do you have any suggestions?
All right, panelists. So I don't know what order you want to take these in, or if you just have some ideas and would like to start a discussion. So please, just the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on one or two. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, on the question of African countries and large oil deposits, I support the position of Carlos Lopez, who was the former Secretary General of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, where he has been arguing for the last year or two that Africa needs to use its fossil fuel resources in order to generate the kinds of surpluses that would be required to then invest in renewable energy infrastructures. So oil, as we all know, oil deposits come to an end at a certain point. And at the moment, oil exploitation in particular is resulting in the buildup of profits for elites in a way that is not necessarily getting reinvested in the kind of post-oil infrastructures that will be required over the long term. So if you're a long-termist thinker, then you cannot depend on the short-termism of oil, especially in light of the fact that oil prices have collapsed, and there's not a lot of chances of them recovering significantly in the short term. So the volatility of oil prices is not something that oil-rich countries stand to benefit from. So diversification of oil is in any case a good idea, economic diversification, so you avoid the negative impacts of oil volatility. But part of that needs to be a long-termist view where you say, okay, what are going to be the energy sources of the future? And that is renewables, especially the low cost and the abundant renewables resources on the continent, including hydro, but also obviously wind and solar. So that's how you need to think about it. You can't think of it in short-termist terms. We've got oil now, so why should we worry? I mean, that's just not the way to think about it. As far as renewable energy in Africa and the potential for leapfrogging, as I understood the question, renewable energy in the African continent is expanding very rapidly, and there are many governments like the Ethiopian government, the Rwandan government, the Moroccan government, and the South African government, but inconsistent, and others have got a very positive view of renewables, and that's largely driven not so much by a desire to save the environment, but by the fact that there is concessional finance available for renewable energy infrastructure projects. Renewable energy costs are very low, and renewable energy infrastructures suit the African grids, which are weak, are not strong at a national level, and so you can build regional grids. So if you have renewable infrastructure, and then if you factor in embedded generation, then you really have quite a positive mix. Just maybe one final comment about the question of justice narratives. I don't think I agree with the statement that there are no long justice narratives in the African context. There's a lot of literature coming out now in sub-Saharan Africa, from sub-Saharan African philosophers, environmental ethicists, and so on, which revolves around a very particular word, and that word is ukama. And ukama is a Shona word. It's a word derived from the language spoken by people who live in the northern part of Zimbabwe, Shona-speaking people. And ukama means, in Shona, relatedness. And it means relatedness not just to each other, which is an anthropocentric conception of relatedness, but also relatedness to the environment, as well as relatedness to the past, present, and the future via the ancestors. So the ancestors are present they come from the past and they advise on the future. And Ukama tends to be have a very broad sense of relatedness to each other, to the environment, and not just animate, but also inanimate matter like rocks and mountains, and to the past, present, and future by the ancestors. And this conception of this Ukamian conception of a relational world, a relational self, a relational society, a relational universe, is the basis for a conception of justice that is not very strong in the Western tradition, which has tended to focus on the individual and individual rationality in a way that has been exclusionary and has also had racist and environmentally destructive consequences. So I would argue that actually African conceptions of justice are ahead of the Western tradition. They've just been suppressed by a colonial narrative which has denigrated the significance of African thinking. And that's starting to change. Thank you.
I can take some questions. So, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say that, okay, let me also take this question of exclusive and inclusive from the, I'm just taking the Indian tradition, and then I would say that the Sanskrit, there is no word which you can find translates exclusion. It is always inclusive. So there does not exist any term called exclusion. This is again a colonial past which has brought in the question of social distancing and then those kind of thing. So in India now, the social distancing, or even in South Asia, this typical term is seen as a very, what should I say, might actually break down the social inclusivity which the post-colonial countries were trying to bring up. And so this social is actually in such infectious or contagious diseases, what you need is physical distancing and quarantine. And if you look into the social norm that we have in terms of measles or in chicken pox, which every season actually in India also, even if they are vaccinated, they face, the mothers know how to quarantine the child or any family member so that other members also doesn't get infected. So there is a whole, traditional, very high knowledge of managing this kind of contagious diseases in India. And with this kind of complete lockdown and kind of concept of social distancing, what it did was are making mothers confused. So the knowledge that is already existing in the society, that will be killed. So that's something which really needs to be talked more. So it is about physical distancing, and the term social distancing actually might create more social division and social exclusion. So these are becoming real societal issue which needs to be understood when we really go for some kind of globalization of the language and riding over the cultural nuances. So there is a very important nuanced approach to this which needs to be taken. And the second thing I would say that whether it is going to be 100% renewable from tomorrow, that really is not the whole discourse that is happening in the world. So it will be a phased manner how you get out of the fossil fuel economy to the more cleaner economy. So from that point of view, there is a transition phase. That's why it is not a disruption, but that a transition phase, there needs to be a planned transition to a newer decarbonized world. And this oil economy also, and oil infrastructure can make the countries, if they do it in such a way so that they can become actually hydrogen economy compatible also. So that's something which really needs to be understood by these countries, whether they give up or they make their infrastructure future ready. So how they take this as a transition phase is really the a discourse which needs to happen in the fossil fuel, and especially the gas and oil rich countries. And so far as circular economy is concerned, and what happens to the other, I mean, those who are in the informal sector who are working in the circular economy of the developing countries, yes, of course, there needs to be a very careful attention to this, because otherwise you live with the indecent jobs. So how you make the decent job more formalized, and then you bring them into the mainstream is an important issue. And from that point of view, in the renewable energy sector, I would say in India, which started 20 years back, 20, 25 years back, with the small entrepreneurs, localized entrepreneurs, rural grids and all, now it has become a business of the very, very high investors and large investors. So this is something which needs to be understood by other, that what happens. I'll just give one more example, that in Bangladesh, say over past 10 years, very small entrepreneurs were coming up, the youths who were setting up the microgrids, and they were serving the villages. Now the government has taken a decision to integrate it with the main grid. And so they are now giving these orders to the large companies, and these entrepreneurs are just out of the whole business and also just do not know how to get integrated. So there is a huge interesting things which are happening in this whole Asian continent, which can be a good learning for many others when we are thinking that renewable can be a socially innovative solution also. But this is something very important to understand, because as these fossil fuel industries are going out of business, they are seeing that this as a new business where they can just build, I mean, in India, miles after miles are being taken to build the solar panels. So this is something very important to understand.
Indeed. Adriana, would you have some comments?
Yes, I would like just a brief comment in the last question, that about circular economy. I think it's an interesting way to think about is how to really include smaller businesses and the informal sector into it. And here in Brazil, we have a very interesting feature in our national policy of solid waste, is that this policy considers the waste pickers as really, and cooperatives of the waste pickers as important players in this reverse logistics chain. So I think it's not only, I think I kind of disagree of this statement that circular economy would be only beneficial for larger companies, but also in the reverse chains, there are huge opportunities for these more kind of informal workers, and there are possibilities, and we have ways of making these informal jobs decent really works that empower these workers to get and give them good job conditions, and also opportunities for the smaller businesses, for example, in refurbishing and renewing used materials. And I think that's the kind of transition for circular economy that we are aiming. And of course, if the larger businesses would be benefit as well in this, but I think it would be beneficial for the whole society as a whole.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Indeed.
All right. Well, I think we have run out of, or even gone over our allotted time today. But thank you so much for these three very interesting and thought-provoking discussions. I'm sure we have so many more, or I know that we have so many more questions out here. So everybody attending, please feel free to get in touch with us, with the professors directly, to continue the discussion. Yes, thank you three so much again. We invite everyone very, very heartily to come and participate in our next webinar, which will be on July 5th. And also, like I mentioned at the beginning, of course, we are looking for presenters, and we are in a bottom-up process of idea finding for these webinars as well. So please, yeah, we have a poll right now on showing your interest in webinars and future webinars. So yeah, please join our webinars, get involved, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for Catarina and Bipashi, Rafael for organizing this. It was a pleasure. Thank you for Professor Joyashree. Nice to meet you. Professor Mark, also nice to hear from you. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.